Well, quickly, I'm almost done. Man. El Shaddai, God says, I am the Almighty God. Now, be perfect, and I will make, he says, verse 2, my covenant between me and thee, and will multiply thee exceedingly. Well, when Abraham heard this, he fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, as for me, behold, my covenant is with thee, and thou shalt be a father of many nations. Neither, verse 5, shall thy name any more be called Abram, but thy name shall be Abraham. For a father of many nations have I made thee. And I will make thee exceedingly fruitful. I will make nations of thee, and kings shall come out of thee. And I will establish my covenant between me and thee, and thy seed after thee in their generations, for an everlasting covenant, to be a God unto thee, and to thy seed after thee. Verse 8, and I will give unto thee and to thy seed after thee the land wherein thou art a stranger right now. You're traveling through. All the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. 4 things to note if you're a note taker to understand what is happening here, because this is the summation of the Abrahamic covenant. That is the agreement, the one-sided agreement, I might say, the unconditional covenant, where God says, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to do this for you, Abraham. We've touched on it before, various passages, chapters 12 and chapters 15 and so forth. But now all the threads are being brought together in this final summation of the Abrahamic covenant. And it's important as it relates to Bible prophecy and current events presently. 4 things to note here. First of all, notice, number 1, the principle. The principle is grace. 24 times God says in this Abrahamic covenant that we have read, 24 times he will say, I will, I will, I will, I will, I will, I will, I will. In other words, he will. I'm doing this. Remember how Abraham had to fall asleep in chapter 15? Remember how they were cutting covenant that day? They cut the meat in 2, and Abraham had to finally fall asleep before God showed up and went all the way through singularly. Remember that story? If you don't get the tape, review it. It's an important story. Normally they would meet in the middle, halfway, 2 parties, and make their agreement, clasping wrists together and stating what each side would do. But in this case, Abraham fell asleep, and then God came through and went all the way by himself, saying, it's what I'm going to do, not what you do. You're not to be trying to make vows to me, promises to me, but you're to be simply taking my word. Not be a promise maker, Abraham, you're to be a promise taker. You're to take my promise. It's for you. I will. In other words, it's all by grace. Now, please note this. Please remember this. Abram's name is changed to Abraham, and Sarai's name will be changed in our next study to Sarah. Both are changed in the same way. The 5th letter of the Hebrew alphabet is added in the middle of both names. The 5th letter. Abram now becomes Abraham. Sarai becomes Sarah. The 5th letter of the Hebrew alphabet is put in the middle of both names. In the Bible, the number 5 is the number of grace. Part of this whole agreement is, I'm going to put it in your name, Abraham, and you too, Sarah. The whole deal is going to be, you are who you are going to be because of grace, not by your works, not by your righteous efforts, not by your devotion, but just because of grace, which is unmerited, undeserved, unearned favor. Grace. So the principle is grace. Secondly, the people. Verse 7, the Jewish people. I will establish my covenant between me and thee and thy seed after thee in their generations for an everlasting covenant. The covenant is not just between God and Abraham, but it's between God and Abraham's seed. That is what comes generation after generation after generation unto everlasting. You say, who cares? When you're analyzing the Middle East situation today, this comes very much into play. God says, Abraham, this is not just for you as a man individually, but for all those that will follow after you perpetually. So the principle is what? Grace. The people are who? The Jews. Number 3, the place. Number 3, the period, if I could. Verse 8, the period. The principle is grace, the people, the Jew, the period. Verse 8, I will give this unto thee and thy seed after thee, all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession. Now, just jot this down because the hour is late. I'll read it to you from Ezekiel chapter 11. And if you're a note taker, this is an important scripture to note down here. Ezekiel 11:17, because when you're listening to Yasser Arafat, you're listening to the claims that they make, well, the land of Palestine is ours. We are Palestinians. And the Jewish people, the nation of Israel, ceased to be in the year AD 70. And they left, and we ultimately moved in, so now we have a right to the land. Well, Ezekiel 11, verse 17 says this, therefore say, thus saith the Lord, I will even gather you, the Jews, from the people, and assemble you out of the countries where you have been scattered. You've been scattered all over, and they were in the year AD 70. And I will gather you, Ezekiel 11:17 says, out of all the countries where you have been scattered, and I will give to you the land of Israel. In other words, after you have been scattered, because the Palestinian people would say, hey, they may have been given the land according to your views of scriptures, but they lost it. And they left or were driven away, but God says it's for an everlasting covenant, and God says, in fact, I'm going to bring you back into the land after I have scattered you. Comprende? Are you with me on this? I'm not trying to waste your time or waste my breath. This is an important truth to put in focus the questions that are now being raised and the debate that is now happening between the Palestinian people and the nation of Israel. God says, even after you are scattered, I will bring you back, and I will give this land unto you, the land of Israel. It's yours. By the way, please understand this, students of history. The Palestinians and others would say, yes, but they were driven away in the year AD 70. And after that came a whole successive wave, or waves, I should say, of conquering people. The Romans and the Turks and the Arabs and the Egyptians again and the Turks once more, and the British finally, before it becomes a nation. But listen very carefully to this, because what you need to say as it relates to the Abrahamic covenant and the questions of who owns the land today. Who was the last group of people to have sovereign control of the land of Israel, had independent sovereign control, not foreigners occupying, but who had independent sovereign control. The last people to have control, not the so-called Palestinians or Arabs or Egyptians, but rather it was the Jew. They were the last people who had control of the land before the land became a nation in May of 48. When did they lose control? What year did the people of Israel, the Jew, lose control? And then it was a series of these conquering countries that took control, all of these different entities. When did they lose control? What year might that be? What's that now? Okay, great guess, 605 BC. That's an earlier time they lost control with the Babylonians, Old Testament time. Excellent. But when was the most recent time before they became a nation? Well, I'll just tell you. Most people would say, if you're tracking with me, well, AD 70, when the Romans destroyed the temple and destroyed the city. But that's not when they lost their sovereignty. They lost their sovereignty before that. In the year approximately AD 12, what happened was, oh my goodness, there was consternation, there was screams and howling in the streets of Jerusalem because the Romans had already conquered the region, but let Israel have autonomy. They were still a sovereign nation. They still made their own rules within the parameters of Rome's occupying the whole region, but Israel still made their own rules until AD 12. In AD 12, Rome said this: because the Jewish people have proved to be so difficult to manage, we now exercise ultimate control. That is, we will now step in and run, if you would, their nation, because we will not allow them to execute capital punishment. AD 12. We talked about this earlier. That is the foundation, according to Genesis, of a sovereign state, of a government, is the ability to execute capital punishment when necessary. The Romans took it away. The rabbis that day realized what that meant, and they threw dust in the air and they ripped their clothes, because in AD 12, when that took place, they realized if we cannot execute our criminals, we no longer have sovereignty. We've lost our independence. Rome has taken that from us. And the reason they were so upset, not just because of patriotism, but because of prophecy. What do you mean, prophecy? Genesis 49 says the scepter. You know what a scepter is? That thing that kings hold where they extend power and make decisions. The scepter shall not depart from Judah until Messiah comes. In other words, Judah, Jerusalem, will be in control, the power of life and death, until Messiah comes. They're never going to lose control. They're going to have control until the day Messiah comes, Genesis 49. But wait, the rabbis were saying, Messiah isn't here. Messiah isn't here, and we're losing the scepter. We can no longer make the decisions about life and death and capital offenses and executions, which are so key to our sovereignty. We've lost the right. They've taken it away, and Messiah isn't here. But little did they know that that very day in AD 12, someone was sitting in the temple during the feast, the festival, confounding the scholars, the scribes, and the teachers with his knowledge of the scriptures. Guess who that might be? It's an amazing correlation of history. Josephus tells the story, not of Jesus in the temple. The Gospels tell us that story. But Josephus gives us the date and the events of AD 12, what took place when they lost their sovereignty. And they thought, prophecy has not come to pass. Genesis, we know the prophecy. How can this be? Little do they know that right then, that very day, Jesus was in the temple. Messiah had come. And the prophecy proved to be true. The scepter will not depart until Messiah comes. And guess who was there? Messiah on that very day in the temple. I love this stuff. But be that as it may, you have the principle of the Abrahamic covenant, grace. You have the people, it's the Jew. You have the period. It's everlasting. Ezekiel 11:17 tells us even after they're scattered, they'll come back together and they will be given the land forever, you see. And finally, and then we're done, you have the place, 300,000 square miles. The land is an exceedingly great land. All of the land of Canaan, dimensions given in chapter 12, 13, 15, the land is a great land. How much land did they take at their greatest extent of their empire? A tenth, which is how much? 30,000, exactly. 30,000 square miles. They only took 1/10 under their greatest extension under Solomon. But let me tell you something. The time is coming when they will inherit all of the land, which God says I'm giving to them as part of this Abrahamic covenant. Well, now, this is the key. The covenant is given. And what God does next is a mind blower. But last night, when I got to this point, much earlier in time than we are this evening, the lights went out. We were through, and so we got to stop here too, and although it is much later tonight. And what we'll do is make sure you come back. Don't miss next week's study, because what happens next is amazing as it relates to the Abrahamic covenant.